There are lots of reasons to use quotations in your writing. For example, maybe an author has written something so beautifully that you can't express it better. Go ahead and quote. Or perhaps you want to borrow the credibility of an expert's words. Again, go ahead and quote. Or maybe it's a case, as in this legal opinion written by Justice Alito, where the precise words of a law matter. Go ahead and quote. So why do we quote? The wording is so good you couldn't have said it better. The exact wording matters. You want the credibility that comes from borrowing the words of an expert. Or you just want to be precise and specific with your evidence when you're trying to prove a point. Again, lots of reasons to quote. However, quoting well and using quotes to actually improve your writing takes a little bit of finesse. What you don't want to do is just dump the quote into your writing. Take a look at this example and think about how the quote is being used. In the ad, Peace Little Girl Daisy, which aired just once in 1964 for Lyndon B. Johnson's presidential campaign, the camera zooms in on a still frame of a young girl's face, and footage of an exploding atomic bomb fills the screen, almost as if the girl's been blown up. The stakes are too high for you to stay home. The ad makes a highly effective emotional appeal. Well, what I'm not liking about this is the way that quote is just thrown in there. You don't know who said it, you don't know where it's happening in the ad. But we could revise this pretty easily and take that same quote and use it in a much more effective way. And let me read you the revised version. In the ad, Peace Little Girl Daisy, which aired just once in 1964 for Lyndon B. Johnson's presidential campaign, the camera zooms in on a still frame of a young girl's face, and an image of an exploding atomic bomb fills the screen, almost as if the girl's been blown up. At the end of the ad, a voiceover narration warns, "The stakes are too high for you to stay home." Although the ad doesn't mention Johnson's opponent Barry Goldwater by name, the message is clear. If voters stay at home, extremist Goldwater could win, resulting in a nuclear war. The ad makes a highly effective emotional appeal. Now, I added two things in here to improve that quote use. First, I added a lead-in that lets you know when the quote is happening in the ad and who's saying the quote. Then I added an explanation of the quote's significance. What's it doing in the ad? How does it prove my point? Sorry. Now, when all you do is give the quote, that's just kind of like giving a bunch of filling when you need a little bread to make the thing hold together. So let's use the sandwich here as an analogy for strong quote use. First, we need to introduce the quote. That's our top bread. Then we give the quote itself, and then we need to make sure we explain that quote, interpret it for our readers. Now let's take a look at that in action. Here's a quote from Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. This is a line that John Proctor is saying when he's given the choice of either signing a false confession regarding witchcraft or being hanged. Here's my top bread, my lead-in. John knows what it's like to live with a lie in his conscience, to feel like a broken man because of a sin, and now he would rather die than sign his name to a lie. After he rips up his false confession, he says, "Now I do think I see some shred of goodness in John Proctor." And here's my explanation. Ripping up the confession allows John to see that despite his past sins, he still retains some integrity, and preserving this integrity is worth anything, even his life. Let's talk about that top piece of bread, the introduction or lead into the quote. Sometimes all you may need is something as simple as so-and-so says, quote. For example, Pat Benatar sings, "Love is a battlefield." If you're writing about a piece of literature, it may be useful to give your reader just a little bit more context, though. So you might follow a pattern like this. After Johnny steals the candy, the head spy tells him, "You just saved the world." I've got my story context, I've got the speaker, I've got the listener, and I've got my quote. This will help situate the reader in the story. So give it a try here. Here's a quote that comes from the Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf, about a hero who goes to fight monsters. The story context here is that Beowulf and his men have just arrived on the shore of the land of the Danes. They're there to fight a monster. The speaker is a sentry whose job is to guard the shores. The listener is Beowulf and his men. Here's the quote. "Nor have I ever seen out of all men on earth one greater than has come with you." Our lead-in might look something like this. When Beowulf and his men arrive on the shore of the land of the Danes, a sentry, whose job is to guard the shores against invaders, tells them, "I've never seen, out of all men on earth, one greater than has come with you." And if you're familiar with the story, you could add the explanation there, get that bottom piece of bread in there too. The sentry is so smitten by Beowulf's appearance that his immediate response is to gush about what a stallion the hero is and to let him and his heavily armed friends in. These monsters don't know what they're in for. Now, occasionally I'll have students who try to lead into a quote using a page number, as in this example of a quote from As It Was in the Beginning, a fabulous short story by the Canadian writer E. Pauline Johnson. On page 48, Esther thinks, kill him, it will break Father Paul's heart and blight his life. This is not terrible, but it would be much more useful to the reader to give a little bit of context about what's happening in the story. Like this. As Esther stands over the sleeping body of her faithless lover, she thinks, kill him, it will break Father Paul's heart and blight his life. Again, giving the reader some context is a little more useful than the page number, and the page number we can always tuck in parentheses at the end. Now let's talk for just a moment about that bottom piece of bread, the explanation. You're the writer. You're using quotes to help you in your writing, but not to replace your own writing. And so it's important that when you include a quote, you don't expect it to speak for you. Instead, you've got to interpret it for the reader. And this is particularly important if you've got a quotation that's got a lot going on in it, or a quotation that could be interpreted in multiple ways. So take a look at this example. Here's one explanation. After Lena expresses her doubts, Darcy pats her on the head and calls her a little darling. Darcy's words and manner show that she is unwilling to take Lynette seriously and still thinks of her as a child. Here's a different explanation. After Lynette expresses her doubts, Darcy pats her on the head and calls her a little darling. Darcy's words and manner show her protective feelings. She views Lynette as a child she needs to take care of and shield from the world. Same quote, right? But two completely different interpretations. Now, a good rule of thumb is that your explanation of the quote should be twice the length of the quote. Now take a look at this explanation and tell me what you notice. Nick describes his cousin Daisy as having a thrilling voice. He calls it a low, thrilling voice. In other words, Daisy's voice gives listeners thrills. I hope what you're seeing there is that the explanation and even the lead-in aren't really adding anything new. In fact, they're kind of making the quotation itself feel redundant. With your explanation, again, you shouldn't just simply be repeating what the quote said. You should be giving your reader some insight into it. So compare these two examples. Think about which one's better. Nick explains that the minute Daisy stops speaking, the minute she ceases to compel him with her fabulous voice, he feels the basic insincerity of her words. He realizes that despite her charm, her words are basically insincere. Nick explains that the minute Daisy stops speaking, the minute she ceases to compel him with her fabulous voice, he feels the basic insincerity of her words. Nick realizes that although Daisy may be charming, she lacks substance, and even the strong emotions she says she feels may be fundamentally untrustworthy. I think the second version works a lot better. With our quote sandwich in mind, let's talk about the mechanics of embedding quotations. We want to work quotations smoothly into our writing. How do we do it? How do we punctuate? How do we capitalize? Now I'm going to work with a quote from the play Hamlet. In this play, Hamlet's father has died and his mother has remarried his uncle like a month after the funeral. So Hamlet's a little unhappy. You can see why he looks depressed. Now, here's something that Hamlet says when he compares his father, the king, to his new king, the uncle, and also gives a little commentary on his mother's behavior. So excellent a king that was to this Hyperion, meaning the sun god, to a satyr. So dad was the sun god, uncle to goat man. So loving to my mother, that he might not beteem the winds of heaven visit her face too roughly. Heaven and earth, must I remember why she would hang on him as if increase of appetite had grown by what it fed on, and yet within a month, let me not think on it. Frailty, thy name is woman. Well, there is a lot going on in this quote, right? So if I'm going to work with it, I need to pare it down to the part that I find essential, the part that I find most quote-worthy. In this case, I think I'm going to go with that really punchy last bit, frailty, thy name is woman. And you know what? I remember being a kid and watching the Mel Gibson version of Hamlet, and he delivered this line just excellently. So here's our line. Okay, how do we embed this in our own writing? Well, first of all, let me just say that I don't think much of the sentiment, but it is a great line. Okay, I could lead into it with words at the beginning. Hamlet cries, frailty, thy name is woman. And if we were writing dialogue, I would call that Hamlet cries a dialogue tag. Now I could slide my words to the middle of the quote. Frailty, cries Hamlet, thy name is woman. Or I could slide them to the end of the quote. Frailty, thy name is woman, cries Hamlet. Okay, any variation of so-and-so said, we're going to call that a dialogue tag. And again, you can put that at the beginning or in the middle or at the end of your quote, wherever it's going to sound best. And that's our first option for embedding a quote. So we're going to call it the dialogue quote. It's going to use that signal phrase or dialogue tag, some variation of so-and-so says, comma, quote. Again, we'll use a comma. And because that quotation is like a sentence within a sentence, we're going to capitalize the first letter of the quote. Now let's try a different lead in here. Maybe I want to give a little explanation moving into this quote. Something like this. His mother's quick remarriage leads Hamlet to conclude that women are weak. Frailty, thy name is woman. Now you'll notice that here, instead of a comma, we've got a colon. And we know that a colon is like that finger point in the sentence that says, there's more, and here's what it is. Now if we use a colon leading into a quote, what that colon is saying is, and here's what he said, or and here's what shows that. You'll notice too that instead of that colon, we could have put a period right there and ended that sentence. We've got that full sentence. So if we use a colon, again, we're going to use it at the end of a full sentence where we could otherwise put a period, but we want that sense of, and here's what shows that, or and here's what he said. So here are a couple examples. This one is from Frank Stockton's short story, The Lady or the Tiger. As the princess contemplates the prospect of her lover marrying her hated rival, she feels great distress. And here's what shows that. She gnashes her teeth and tears her hair, and her soul burns in agony. Here's an example again from The Crucible. Judge Danforth tells the court that Mary may be lying and gives a stern warning. And here's what he said. Her neck will break for it. So let's add that to our list, option 2, the colon quote. You're going to write a full sentence leading into the quote. You'll attach the quote with a colon. You'll use a capital letter on the quote. And if you do this right, you should have a sense of, and here's what he said, or here's what proves that. Let's return to that quote from Hamlet and pick another part of it to work with. Maybe this time I just want a couple of words, like the part where he's comparing his father to the sun god and his uncle to a goat man, Hyperion to a satyr. Not a very flattering comparison. Okay, so here's my quote. And here's how I'm going to work into it. Hamlet believes his father was as superior to his uncle as Hyperion to a satyr. Now, in this case, I don't have any punctuation leading into that quote. In fact, if you could not see the quotation marks on the screen, you wouldn't even know I was quoting. We're going to call this option a flow quote. It's where you've so smoothly worked that quote into your sentence that it's basically become one with your sentence. Now, I've capitalized Hyperion because it's a name, but otherwise I wouldn't be capitalizing with this sort of quote integration. Here's an example from The Great Gatsby. Nick explains that once he's free from the charm of Daisy's voice, he feels the basic insincerity of her words. Again, if you didn't see the quotation marks, you were hearing me read this out loud, you wouldn't know I was quoting. There'd be no pause moving into that quote. It would just feel like it was part of my sentence. Or here's another example from Ray Bradbury's short story, The Veldt. When George Hadley threatens to lock up Peter's beloved nursery, his son tells him that he doesn't want to do anything but look and listen and smell. What else is there to do? Now, when you lead into a quote with a that almost always makes it be a flow quote. Now, you'll notice here that I also use some brackets to alter the quote just a little bit to make it work with this construction, and we'll talk about that at a later point. If you've ever read The Veldt, you'll probably understand the lines on the screen. So adding that to our list of options, number 3, the flow quote. If you work a quote in so smoothly that there's no pause at all leading into it, don't use any punctuation, don't capitalize the first word of the quote. Now, returning to our frailty, thy name is woman quote, let's look at one more possibility. Hamlet's words show how disgusted he is with his mother. Frailty, thy name is woman. Now, I hope you're noticing something wrong here. I hope you're noticing that comma. I'm trying to attach this quote onto a full sentence with a comma, and that just does not work. That's a comma splice. When you try to hook two sentences, two independent clauses together with just a weak little comma, it's like trying to splice two wires with Scotch tape. The Scotch tape just is not strong enough to do the job. And it doesn't work. Normally, it doesn't work with a quotation either. Now, in this case, we could easily fix this by swapping out that comma for a colon. Hamlet's words show how disgusted he is with his mother. And here's what he says, or, and here's what shows this. Frailty, thy name is woman. So I'm going to add that to the bottom of my list with the big red warning to not do this. Don't try to integrate your quote with a comma splice. You do not want to have a full sentence, a comma, and then your quote. If you want that full sentence lead-in, try the colon instead. When used skillfully, quotations can enhance our writing. Above all, we want to make sure that the quotation feels like it belongs there, though. And to do this, we might follow this quote sandwich pattern. First, introduce the quote, say who sang it, where it came from, give that lead-in, then provide the quote, and then explain the quote and what its significance is. When we embed our quotations, we've got three options: the dialogue lead-in, which will be some variation of so-and-so says, comma, quote, capital letter on the quote. We can also use the colon lead-in, which will be a full sentence, colon, quote, again, capital letter on the quote. And if we've used this correctly, we should have that sense of, and here's what she said, or, and here's what proves that. And then we can use a flow quote, where we take a portion of a quote and work it into our writing so smoothly that there's no pause leading in, and it's just perfectly blended with our writing. And when you master all of this, you'll be on your way to using words more skillfully.